So my name is Frank. This is Payman. This is the latest episode of Machine Learning and Data Mining, CS340. And today we're going to do a little bit more clustering. But last time, like usual, let's link it to what we did, which was k-means clustering. And we set up this problem where we are given X, but we are not given Y. So we're in the supervised learning, unsupervised learning case. And we'd like to take our examples living in some feature space d-dimensional and assign them or group them somehow, right? So here's our canonical example over here with some data items living in two-dimensional feature space. And we'd like to be able to basically color this plot, assign them to clusters, right? So k-means clustering defines the groups by the means. So we have this W vector, which was k by d, which had the means of each of the clusters. And there was an algorithm that assigned examples to the nearest mean and updates means during the training, so on and so forth, such that these means are computed, or some set of, in this case, 4 means is computed. And that is the parametric model, which is k-means clustering, right? So let's be clear. All you need are these means, and the rest of the data items that can be assigned to these means by just computing distances. So we don't need to keep the data around, just keep the means around. And when we think about this, basically, you can think about these means as representing the data as well. We talked a little bit about vector quantization, where we use the means as prototypes for the groups, and you can think about this as a lossy compressor or whatever. Okay. There are some issues with k-means. It's fast, really sensitive to the initialization. So depending on which points you choose as the initializing points, you're going to get a different clustering outcome for sure. And how to choose k is annoying. There really isn't a good right answer, so on and so forth. Okay. Something also to think about, and this is related to what we did when we were thinking about the supervised learning case of decision trees. You know, a decision tree basically divides feature space into some sort of axis-aligned half spaces, recursively partitions space, such that we have some partition there, and there's some data that goes into that partition. We make a choice about what's going on there. So we can think about the decision surface in this supervised learning case as being a bunch of intersections of axis-aligned half planes, right? Okay. And then we can think about k nearest neighbors with k, nearest neighbors equals 1. You have a bunch of data, and you can have a very, very complex decision surface between two different classes. Okay? So we can think about the same kind of a thing in unsupervised learning, right? And ask, for instance, what are the shape of the clusters induced by the k-means clustering algorithm, or induced by the k-means clustering loss, right? So k-means partitions the space based on the closest mean, right? So, basically there's a partition between this purple and blue subspace, and there's a partition between the blue and the green subspace, and there's a partition between the red and the blue subspace, and so on and so forth, right? These are all half planes as well. Great. Everything in there is close to the green, everything in there is close to the red. So what you should observe is that the clusters are convex regions. As you could prove this relatively straightforward. It's intersections of half spaces. Proofs in the bonus slides. But the point is, you can look at this and just see that the clusters are convex regions. What do we mean by convex regions or convex set? A set is convex. This is the definition, one of the definitions of convexity. If a line between 2 points in the set stays in the set, so all the points along the line, right? So that's convex. This is convex. There's no way you can draw a line that goes outside. This is not convex. Okay.
Does it generate Voronoi regions?
Indeed, that's exactly what Voronoi regions are. And that's what vector quantization does. Good point. Good catch. So you can ask yourself, if we're clustering, is it natural or is it appropriate that cluster regions are shaped like this? Is this inductive bias the right inductive bias to apply in your clustering algorithm? Not obvious, right? So, these are all convex. What are some issues with it? Well, the clusters in the data in, feature space might not actually be convex. Does this point here actually belong in the red cluster? Does this point here actually belong in the blue cluster? Does this point here actually belong in the green cluster? Right? It's not obvious, right? And what if, what if, well, you'll see in just a second. What if we have clusters that look like this? Okay, and then how many clusters are in this data set? Two. Okay. I doubt anybody's going to complain about this this claim, right? And how do we know whether or not our data looks like this in feature space or like this in feature space? We don't. We don't know, right? So we're making a strong assumption when we deploy an algorithm like k-means about the distribution of points in feature space. Maybe it's appropriate, maybe it's not. Let's think about what kind of algorithm we could use or model we could use, but here we're really going to talk about an algorithm that we could use to cluster data like this. Noting that k-means, say for instance with k equals 2, is just simply not going to be able to produce clusters that are in good correspondence with what we think the clustering should be, i.e. a separation between these two regions of high density. And that's a hint about what we're going to do. Just as a side note, something that you can do to address this density problem is use k-means or something like that, but with a very, very, very small, with a very large number of k, basically, right? And if you over cluster this, then you could hope that the cluster boundaries between all the little clusters actually produce a boundary here. Then there's another problem of how do you link these little clusters in a way that actually separates the two clusters as you would wish them to be clustered. So then you cluster the clusters, and think about this when we get to the hierarchical clustering part of the lecture on. If you build a hierarchical cluster of all of these, and you see when they come together, then you would hope that at the very top of this, you might be able to find two clusters.
Can we map non-convex clusters to,
yeah, finish it. Yeah, so can we map non-convex clusters to convex clusters so that we can use k-means? Well, I would posit that the nonlinear transformation that you would have to do to this feature space in order to have k-means produce the clusters that you want is going to be a non-trivial thing to find. We will talk a little bit about manifold learning and feature transformations that make space more regular in this way, but it's really not obvious when you're doing density-based clustering. When clustering the cluster k-means results in the original problem. Yeah, so I didn't say cluster the clusters with k-means. I said cluster the clusters, and I specifically talked about hierarchical clustering there. So, good point. Yeah, indeed, it would basically cause the same problem. Okay, so can we come up with a general purpose, high performance alternative method for clustering that has different properties than k-means?
Wouldn't that require that we know that this paternity exists in feature space?
Thankfully, we don't have any paternity issues in this course yet. I don't think, and COVID is probably likely to keep it that way. So Ilias, this is good. This is a good point. So if we go back here, like in order to, okay, yeah. Again, there is no right clustering. So you as the user are going to have an idea about what is a right clustering or not a right clustering. So we mentioned this so that you all don't go off and blindly start using k-means and thinking that this is the clustering algorithm that will end all clustering algorithms, and the clusters that you get out of it are the right clusters, right? If this pattern exists, then you might find better performance. Like the whole point is when you do clustering, then you have to go in, usually manually, but let's just consider manually. You have to go in and examine each cluster and say, is there actually some regularity to this cluster? Does it make sense, right? So if you apply k-means to this, and these are some sort of patient records or something like that, the clusters you get out are going to be nonsensical. You won't be able to analyze them and make sense of them. But if you use a different clustering algorithm, the clusters actually still might make sense. Okay, yeah, so also Ilias, same question. In order to map non-convex clusters to convex clusters, yes, we need to do something like know that these exist as well. That's true. But let's think about density. So John Snow, the father of epidemiology, so to speak, noticed a pattern when he was trying to figure out what was going on with cholera. When he looked at maps of central London, he saw increasing density of cholera-related deaths. Okay, and it turns out that they surrounded a central water pump. Okay, and basically this clustering, which is what we're really talking about, gave rise to the opportunity, just looking at the data. So you look at the data, and then you find features which include their spatial location, and then you cluster them and find dense regions, and those dense regions ended up pointing to a hypothesis about why and how cholera was spread. Like COVID now, we didn't really know, they didn't know then how cholera was spread, but they figured out later that this pump, which was discovered by clustering regions of high density in London, they found out that this was contaminated, and thus epidemiology, thus water treatment systems. Okay, cool, awesome. So this is a reasonable motivation for density-based clustering. In density-based clustering, clusters are defined by dense regions, right? And examples in non-dense regions don't get clustered. We're not trying to partition the space like we did. We're just trying to find clusters, okay? And for lots and lots of applications, clusters are really all about density. So if you care about like where elephants live, like elephant habitats clustering, right? These are affected by vegetation, mountains, blah, 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 all sorts of environmental factors. But the point is, elephants live in these really wonkily shaped things, right? That's not like a k-means clustering of space. It's just, here are clusters where elephants live, okay? So, I didn't fix this in between lectures, sorry. What we're going to talk about is a non-parametric clustering method. So in the same sense as in the supervised learning case, we talked about parametric models and non-parametric models. The same thing can be done in clustering, right? You can have parametric clustering models and non-parametric clustering models. And we're going to talk about a non-parametric clustering method. There's not a fixed number of clusters K. The clusters get more complicated with more data. And in fact, in actual fact, the clustering is represented by linkages between the entire data set, right? So the model is the model is the data itself. That's an interesting point from Hakeem. If you took CS340, if you were to have taken CS340 with me in the spring, you would have already done a competition on COVID and 19. But not density-based clustering. Instead, we looked at lung X-rays and tried to detect COVID from them. So there are lots of potential applications, like crime clusters, places where taxis should patrol to pick up patients, more basketball where Andre Iguodala make or miss shots, similar products, blah, 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 so on and so forth, okay? So the algorithm we're going to talk about is called DBSCAN, and it's a density-based clustering algorithm with two hyperparameters. Epsilon, which is basically epsilon for epsilon ball. It's going to be a distance that we use to decide whether or not another point is a neighbor. Okay, so here are some points that we might wish to cluster. Here is a point that we pick at random. Here is an epsilon ball whose radius is epsilon. Okay, so the things circled in green are neighbors of the central point in the blue box. Okay. The second hyperparameter is min neighbors. It's the number of neighbors needed to say that a region is dense. Okay. So if you have at least min neighbors, you're called a core point. Okay, this is just some terminology, right? So if min neighbors here is 3, 1, 2, 3, well, we've got more than that, we've got 6. So this point is a core point. Okay, cool. The main idea is to merge or link together, kind of the same thing, all neighboring core points to form clusters. So a cluster is just a set of linked core points, and one other thing, and we'll see that here. So Bainat, how many clusters are there here?
Is it the left and right, or like?
No, this is all data. It's just like a really weird distribution of data in feature space.
I guess say 5.
5. Okay, he says 5. Okay, I could go with that. That seems pretty reasonable. We've got 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. That what you see?
Well, I was considering like the random, but it's also a cluster.
You weren't considering what?
The random dots that are there are also like a cluster.
Oh, you wanted these to be in a cluster as well.
Yeah, the whole thing, like because they
okay, yeah. So yeah, so let's go. So DBSCAN has this thing where we just are going to be able to ignore outliers. So DBSCAN is not going to actually cluster all the points, which is different than k-means, okay? Because we're not actually partitioning space, we're just connecting together dense regions of feature space, okay? So core points are points that have many points nearby. We just went through that. Clusters contain all core points that can be reached by following a sequence of core points. Okay, so yeah, that's these 5 clusters, right? But now watch carefully. Like say for instance here and here and here and here, here, here and here. Okay, watch the colors change. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. Everybody can see the cluster colors change. I hope. Yeah. So clusters also, by definition of this algorithm, include all non-core neighbors of core points. Okay, these are called boundary points. Doesn't really matter. It's pretty simple, right? Great. Okay, and these things, not clusters. They're not clustered at all. They're just outliers. Okay. So let's think about how one might implement DBSCAN and go through some pseudocode, because you might be asked to do something like that. So for each example xi, if xi is already assigned to a cluster, do nothing. Yeah. Then test whether or not xi is a core point. In other words, are there greater than or equal to min neighbors examples within the epsilon ball? If x is not a core point, do nothing. Could be an outlier, who knows? If x is a core point, make a new cluster and call an expand cluster subroutine, okay? And what does expand cluster do? It assigns to this cluster all of the other points, xj, within the epsilon ball of the core point to the cluster, and then for each new core point found, you call expand cluster recursive. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like. Okay, so out of this data, we say we chose this as our first point. That's the first one we chose, right? We construct the epsilon ball. We check how many points are in the radius. If it's above our threshold of min neighbors, which in this particular case it is, we call that a core point, and we make a new cluster with points within the epsilon ball. Then we need to go through each of these. We need to put all of these points basically on a queue, right? And continue, right? So calling the expand cluster function. So so we test to see whether or not each added point is the core point. Here it is. So we add its neighbors, and now the queue has all of this stuff on it, but we're continuing on to recursively select this one preferentially. This is a core point, so we add its neighbors. We go down here, construct the epsilon ball. It's not a core point, we don't add its neighbors. We go back and we recur and do all of these, and we get no new core points to expand here, right? Fine. We select, we continue scanning through our data. We select a new point. We check to see whether or not it's a core point. It's not. We continue scanning. We come over here. It's a core point. We run expand cluster, so on and so forth on all of these, and this is the final result. So we have 2 clusters here and a bunch of outliers. Okay. Cool. There should be a link on Piazza, and I'll update the slides at some point with the interactive demo. The link in the slides is actually out of date, so we fixed that. It should be on Piazza now. It's pretty obvious what DBSCAN is going to do based on the algorithm. There are some issues. So some points are not assigned to a cluster. Is this good or bad? It sort of depends on the application, right? There's an ambiguity about what to do with non-core boundary points, right? So you know, there's a boundary here. What do we do with this one? We could throw it out. We could you know, arbitrarily assign it to one of the clusters. It's an algorithm choice. Obviously, the clusters that are discovered are sensitive to the choice of epsilon and min neighbors, right? And there's a way to set some of these hyperparameters using a summary statistic you can compute of the clustering algorithm as it goes, right? Or as you run it with different numbers of different values of epsilon and min neighbors, right? It's not that critical, and you can look at it in the bonus slides. Otherwise, it's density-based clustering, or DBSCAN, is not sensitive to initialization, right? So you're just going to scan through the data items over and over and over, except for these boundary points, which is, you know, who knows what you do with them. It's a choice. Of course, if you get a new example, finding the cluster is expensive. That's in relative comparison to k-means, where you just look at however many k-means there are, and you assign to the nearest one, right? You need to compute distances to all the core points, or maybe all training points, or something very close to basically all the training points. This is why it's a non-parametric model. And of course, just like in non-parametric models like k-nearest neighbors, you might need a very large number of points in order to actually fill feature space in some sense, right? So the clusters that you get in high dimensions, an effective clustering in high dimensions might require you to have a pretty large epsilon ball, and those clusters might not actually correspond to what you want, right? So nature uses things that look a lot like density-based clustering. So basically, there's this thing called quorum sensing, where bacteria release a particular molecule, and they have sensors for this molecule. And if the sensors become very active, it means that the cell density is super high. And when they're very active, this can cause a cascade of changes in the cells, and they stick together or form a biofilm or a physical layer or something like that, right? And that's literally actually, you know, physical objects clustering together and clustering in a density-based way, which is kind of cool. Questions at this point? Should be pretty straightforward. There's really nothing super complicated about this. Like I said, quick, easy lecture today. Everybody gets to go home or stay home, or go outside if you're here. Enjoy the lovely, warm afternoon. All right, we'll power on then. So In classification, we talked about ensembling, and ensembling generally made things better. Can we think about ensembling clustering, right? Can we run multiple copies of k-means and do a better job than just running one copy of k-means? The answer is yes, but you have to be careful. So we can consider ensemble methods for clustering, so consensus clustering, whatever. It's a good idea. It's used pretty widely. Bootstrapping is one of the mechanisms that's used, right? And really the kind of questions that you can answer or ask are, do clusters in some way change if the data was slightly different, right? But we need to be careful, and this is the part about how we combine models, and it has to do with label switching and invariances, right? So if we run k-means 20 times and then cluster using the mode of each y hat I, this would be insane in the clustering case, right? So normally averaging across models doing different things is good, but in this case, this ensemble clustering thing is worse. It's worse than k-means on its own, right? So you've got disparate clusters with the same labels. It's all a mess, right? And why, right? And it doesn't work because of a label switching problem, which is something that sometimes it takes a long time for people to think about, but it's obvious when you think about it, right? The cluster labels y hat I are meaningless, right? So basically, you can permute the labels. You can take the red, we'll call this 1, and the purple, we'll call this 2, and we'll just say that we're going to call this 1 and this 2 instead, right? So we've permuted the labels, we've changed the colors, but the clusters are the same, right? And because of this, so I guess that's the label here. I should do it like that. That makes more sense. 2, 1, 0, 0, 3, 3. Okay, so we've just permuted the labels, changed the colors, but the clustering is the same, right? The problem is that if you do random restarts, right, all of the labels will become equally likely for all the data items as the number of initializations increase, right?
When we're doing ensemble learning, can we figure out which labels are the same by their location?
So this is one way of asking, nice question, Sean. This is one way of asking how do the clusterings change, right? So one way to root and break the symmetry is to say, I care about the cluster label of this point, okay? And I want to know how big the cluster is associated with this data point, or so on and so forth. So that kind of question is label invariant, right? You can ask questions about the cluster situated at a particular point, yes, right? But the kinds of questions that you really can ask are kind of limited, right? Which is to say, you can't ask, is customer I in the frequent user cluster, right? It doesn't, is xi in red cluster, it doesn't make any sense. It's meaningless because of the label permutation problem. But you can ask, is point I and point j, xi and xj, in the same cluster? That is meaningful, and that will be different depending on the clustering. So you can look at, say, for instance, the proportion of times that xi and xj are clustered together. To respond to Sean's question, a point that you'd be defining what your algorithm would output by predefining label locations, I think it's better to think about the fact that the kinds of questions that you can ask of a clustering algorithm, an ensemble clustering approach, have to be invariant to permutations of the labels. So just think about 100 different clusterings and all the permutations of the labels that can take place, right? So you can ask questions about the size or shape or whatever of the cluster at a particular location, but you can't ask, is the red cluster at this location? Because the red cluster doesn't make any sense. The red cluster is going to move all around, right? That's really the issue. Okay, cool.
What if they don't find the same location?
I skipped Alan's question because the location is the feature vector. So the locations won't switch around, or you can just define a point in feature space. Cool. Oh dear. Any more questions? Thank you. Questions are lovely. Easy. All right. Moving on. You might be curious about what happens if there are different densities, right, of points, right? So, Payman, how many clusters are here?
It depends on the epsilon.
Whoa. Good, nice. Okay, so you've recognized the tricky bit here, right? So these are set so that this length is about the same as this length, right? So if we're doing density-based clustering, as we grow epsilon, right, you can see this as, you know, one cluster or two clusters or two clusters and a bunch of outliers, or it's not exactly clear, right? So, you know, if you have a small epsilon, you're going to get two clusters and some outliers. If you increase epsilon, you're going to get two big clusters, right? So on and so forth. The point is that there may be no density level that gives you the three clusters that you would like to see, right? And here's something even worse, right? So if you have these points out here, is, you know, how many clusters are in this data? It's really difficult to say, right? Is that a cluster or is it not? So tough to say. So instead of fixed clusterings, what we often want is some sort of hierarchical clustering, right? And basically, hierarchical clustering is a tree of clusterings. So each node in the tree splits the data into two or more clusters. Okay, there's lots of ways of doing hierarchical clustering. Again, like we normally do in this class, we'll talk about sort of the simplest, most robust, most widely used, and just understand there's a huge literature on hierarchical clustering. Whichever hierarchical clustering approach you take, there's much more information available in a hierarchical clustering than there is in a fixed clustering. Okay, so let's look at what a hierarchical clustering would look like for data like this. So to start, here's the simple cluster. Everything is in one cluster. Okay, then let's think about decreasing epsilon, for instance, right? As you decrease epsilon, this would separate into two clusters. And here's a tree, you know, right side, left side, right? As you continue to decrease epsilon, here, right, this is continuing to decrease epsilon going to 0. This one would split into two clusters as well, right? And as you keep decreasing epsilon, basically at the end of the day, you end up with individual data points as leaves, okay? And I'll stress this a couple of times, but the point is that you have multiple clusterings of the data here. Like if you draw a line here, you have two clusters and some outliers. You draw a line here, you have two clusters with no outliers, so on and so forth, right? So you have a bunch of you have a bunch of clusters at different levels of granularity. And there are a huge number of applications of hierarchical clustering. Like if we sequence the genomes of a set of organisms, so let's look here, for instance, at a bunch of dogs and importantly, some outliers. Okay, dog-like animals, right? Can we construct a tree of life? Can we figure out the divergence of one species from the next, right? So on the right here are individuals, right? And as you go left, the clusters merge, and the merges are some sort of common ancestor, right? Common ancestor between all of the foxes of a particular kind, and wolves and dogs, and jackals and wolves, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. So somewhere back in time, there was an ancestor that gave rise to them all. Okay. There's a lot of useful information in the plot. The line lengths can be chosen and can be inferred to approximate time. You can ask like how many clusters are there. Like there's all kinds of statistics that you can take basically by constructing bootstrap samples and counting various aspects of clusterings, and you can do some sanity checking debugging basically by putting in outlier groups to make sure that they're clustered in last so that you know that your clustering is okay. There's, this is one application. Language phylogenetics is another awesome application of hierarchical clustering where you take entire languages and construct features of the languages, various spellings of root forms, forms of common words, ways of attaching adjectives and adverbs and so on and so forth to nouns and prepositional phrases, that sort of thing. And you can basically come up with a language tree where all of the languages diverge in the same sort of hierarchical manner as we just saw. Pretty cool. Arguably, the easiest and most common form of hierarchical clustering is agglomerative or bottom-up clustering. Basically, agglomerative clustering starts with every point in its own cluster, and then starts attaching clusters by merging according to closeness. Okay, so here in feature space, D and E are closest, so we merge those two, and then B and C are the next closest, so we merge those two, and then the cluster DE is, well, we haven't said exactly how we're going to compute distances. This is an implementation choice or model specific choice, but here the cluster DE is closest to F, and then make another cluster, and so on and so forth. And the output of this clustering algorithm is this entire tree. Okay, and again, you can look at what happens when you draw different lines at different levels of this, right? So one clustering is A versus everything else. Another one is, A versus B, C, and D, E, F, and so on and so forth, right? So we get a large number of clusterings as we split along vertical dimensions of the tree, okay? Obviously, agglomerative clustering needs a distance between two clusters, and a standard choice is some notion of distance between the means of the clusters, right? So it's not necessarily the best. We have notions of norms, we have different notions of means, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of ways to think about this. You can look in the bonus slides for them, or look up various agglomerative clustering algorithms in the literature. Because you have to constantly scan over all the existing clusters, the cost is cubic and in for basic implementation, which is not particularly pretty, but you get much more from it. So, like I said, it's a quick, short, easy lecture today. Everybody should be happy. I can go on if there's appetite for it. We can start the next lecture if you want. But today's summary is, we talked about the shape of K-means clusters. We partitioned space into convex sets. We said maybe that's not the right inductive bias for clustering because it's not going to give us clusters that are non-convex. So what do we do? Maybe we could do density-based clustering, which is a non-parametric form of clustering. And we gave an algorithm for doing it, which expands and merged dense regions of points to find clusters. It's not sensitive to initialization or outliers, and it's useful for finding non-convex connected clusters. We talked about mostly issues arising from ensembled clustering, but if you aren't interested in, say, for instance, stability of pairings or something like that, you can ask really interesting questions and get powerful results from establishing that a clustering is robust to initialization and bootstrapping, that sort of thing. And we gave a little overview of hierarchical clustering, where we basically did a agglomerative clustering and pointed out that you get more information than you do from a particular fixed clustering. Okay, and that's it. Unless I see overwhelming support for continuing from the audience. Let's see how many people showed up. That's 70. Holy cow! I think you beat the other section for the first time. That's great. Would anybody like me to continue on to the next lecture, or would everybody like to go out and enjoy the day, or go to bed if you're in a different time zone? We talk a little bit about, we start with a little bit of bi-clustering, and then we go from there. The next lecture would be on Wednesday, indeed. Let's vote. Okay, so who wants me to continue? Thumbs
Because
up.
you just press yes in the participant.
Oh yeah, you can press, yeah, all in favor say, where is it polling? Is it polling? Yeah.
No, they can just go to the participant tab and then go yes. Well, all you
Oh
can do
yeah,
is
yeah, exactly. Yes to continue, no to stop. Let's have a vote. How do you count them, by the way? Do you know how to count them? Oh yeah, they're there. Okay. I'll take questions while this is going on. It's looking like the no's are going to have it. How do you say your, okay. Yeah, so Dominic, this is a good question. This is a basic implementation. You can go much, much faster. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, the votes are in, and everyone who voted yes gets extra credit in my heart, although I'm not going to keep track of it, but I'm looking to see who voted yes. It makes me feel really, really good. But the no's have it very clearly. So I think we'll leave off here today with 8 minutes to spare. No, final grades will not be affected by such votes. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we'll make it an easy day today. Thank you very much for your time.